Fishing has always been my sanctuary. The gentle ripple of water against the shore, the patient wait for that magical tug on the line, and the satisfaction of harmony with nature. These were the reasons I saved for 15 years to purchase my dream home on Willow Lake. Everyone in the Lakeview Estates neighborhood envied the prime location, a modest three-bedroom with direct water access and the most picturesque view of the sunrise over the eastern shore. Each morning followed the same perfect routine. I would wake before dawn, brew a strong cup of coffee, and walk the stone path from my back patio to my small private dock. The world remained asleep while I prepared my gear, attached fresh bait, and cast my line into the misty waters. Those quiet hours before the neighborhood stirred were sacred to me. No emails, no meetings, no distractions, just the peaceful communion between man and nature. My first 3 months in Lakeview Estates were blissful. I met several neighbors who shared friendly waves from their decks. The community seemed pleasant enough, though I rarely attended any social functions, preferring the company of the lake to awkward small talk. I had heard rumors about the strictness of the homeowners association, but since my property remained well-maintained, I paid little attention to their rules beyond the standard lawn care requirements. That all changed on a brisk Tuesday morning in October. I returned from my morning fishing to find an official envelope taped to my front door. The Lakeview Estates HOA logo glared at me from the corner of the crisp white paper. Inside was a formal warning citing unauthorized recreational activities on community property. The letter stated that fishing required prior board approval and was subject to specific seasonal restrictions. A fine of $150 would be issued if the activity continued. I was certain this was a misunderstanding. The property listing had specifically advertised private lake access with fishing rights as a key selling point. At the next monthly HOA meeting, I arrived early and signed up to speak during the open forum segment. The community center meeting room filled with about 30 residents, most looking bored or scrolling through their phones. 7 board members sat at a long table at the front, their nameplates displayed prominently. Next speaker, Michael Davis, regarding lake usage, announced the secretary, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses. I approached the podium with my documents in hand. Good evening. I am here to address the warning I received about fishing on the lake. My property deed specifically includes riparian rights, and the real estate listing confirmed fishing privileges. I have brought copies of both documents for your reference. Before I could continue, the HOA president interrupted. Mr. Davis, I am familiar with your situation. I am Sandra Winters, president of the board. The community knew her simply as Karen behind her back. Her blonde hair was styled in the iconic asymmetrical cut, and her voice carried the practiced authority of someone used to getting her way. Fishing creates noise disturbances for lakefront residents and can lead to environmental issues, she continued, not even glancing at my documentation. The board has decided to enforce stricter control over lake activities this year. Your 3 minutes are up. Next speaker, please. I stood there, stunned by the abrupt dismissal. But you have not even looked at my documentation, I protested. Rules are rules, Mr. Davis, she replied, her lips curling with particular disdain. Some of us find fishing to be a primitive and disruptive hobby. Next speaker. 2 weeks later, a second envelope arrived. This time, it contained a fine for $250 and noticed that continued violations would result in liens against my property. As I stared at the paper in disbelief, my phone buzzed with a neighborhood app notification. I opened it to find a photo posted just that morning, board member Thomas Jenkins proudly displaying a large trout caught at our beautiful Willow Lake. In the background of the image, I could clearly see Sandra Winters herself, rod in hand, smiling at the camera. The discovery of such blatant hypocrisy ignited something within me. That evening, I pulled out the welcome packet I had received when purchasing the home. Inside was a thick booklet labeled Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association, Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. I had skimmed it previously, focusing mainly on the sections about external home modifications and landscaping requirements. Now, I read every word with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for a career-defining case. The language regarding lake usage was frustratingly vague. Section 7.3 stated that recreational water activities must conform to community standards and may be subject to board approval. No specific mention of fishing appeared anywhere in the document. I highlighted this section and continued reading, making careful notes of every ambiguity and contradiction I found. The next day, I noticed my neighbor Frank watering his garden. Frank had lived in Lakeview Estates for over a decade and had always been friendly but reserved. I decided to approach him. "Good morning, Frank. Can I ask you something about the HOA?" Frank looked around nervously before responding. "What do you want to know?" "I received fines for fishing in the lake. Does that seem right to you?" Frank shut off his hose and lowered his voice. "Listen, Michael, this is not the first time Sandra has targeted someone. 2 years ago, the Andersons installed a small fountain in their backyard pond. Sandra claimed it violated noise ordinances even though you could barely hear it from 2 feet away. They fought it for months, racked up thousands in legal fees, and eventually gave up and moved. Sandra likes control, and she particularly dislikes anyone who enjoys the lake more than she does." "But I have seen board members fishing," I said. "Of course you have. Rules apply differently to board members and their friends. They call it official conservation monitoring when they do it." Frank shook his head. "Be careful, Michael. This is not a fight most people win." His warning only strengthened my resolve. That weekend, I drove to the county record's office. The clerk appeared surprised when I requested all documentation related to Willow Lake ownership and water rights dating back 20 years. "Research project?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "Something like that," I replied. For hours, I pored over property maps, deed transfers, and development permits. What I discovered was fascinating. Willow Lake had not originally been part of the Lakeview Estates development. It had been purchased separately by Lakefront Holdings LLC, which then granted certain usage rights to the HOA through a complex agreement. The company retained actual ownership of the water body while allowing the HOA to manage surface activities. I took photographs of the most relevant documents and made official copies of others. The next day, I called my law school roommate, David Chen, who had become a successful property attorney. "David, I need a consultation about some HOA issues," I explained when we met at his downtown office. "HOAs can be nightmares," David said after listening to my story. "But this situation might be more interesting than you realize." He examined the county records I had gathered. Lakefront Holdings LLC appears to be a subsidiary of the original development company. They maintained ownership of the lake itself while selling the surrounding properties at premium prices because of lake access. The HOA has management rights, but not complete jurisdiction. David pointed to a specific clause in the agreement. "Look here. The HOA can establish reasonable rules for shared enjoyment, but cannot restrict traditional water activities without demonstrable cause related to safety or environmental protection." "So their fishing ban is potentially unenforceable?" I asked. "Potentially, but fighting an HOA is expensive and exhausting. They have collective resources and can drag things out until you give up." David flipped through more pages. "However, there is another angle here. Have you noticed that Lakefront Holdings has not been mentioned in any recent HOA documentation? I shook my head. That is interesting because they are the actual owners. I wonder if the current HOA board even remembers this arrangement. It has been nearly 20 years since these agreements were signed. Over the next several weeks, I documented every instance of selective enforcement I observed. I photographed board members fishing. I recorded the dates and times of my observations. I collected testimony from Frank and two other neighbors who had witnessed similar hypocrisy. I was building my case methodically, preparing not just for self-defense, but for something much bigger. With my evidence compiled, I formally submitted an appeal against the fishing fines. The HOA bylaws allowed property owners to contest violations through a hearing process. I prepared a professional presentation with three main arguments: the vague language in the covenants, the selective enforcement of rules, and the original property marketing materials promising fishing rights. The appeal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in November. I arrived early, dressed in a suit and tie, carrying a leather portfolio containing my evidence and documentation. The meeting room was already half full with homeowners curious about the agenda items. The 7 board members entered together, taking their seats at the elevated table. Sandra Winters sat in the center, flanked by Vice President Jenkins and Treasurer Williams. First item on the agenda: appeal of recreational activity violations at 427 Lakeside Drive, announced the secretary. Mr. Davis, you have 10 minutes to present your case. I approached the podium and distributed copies of my documentation to each board member. Thank you for hearing my appeal tonight. I believe the fishing restrictions have been applied incorrectly and inequitably in my case. I proceeded to outline my 3 arguments, pointing to specific sections in the documentation I had provided. When I reached my evidence of selective enforcement, I connected my phone to the projector and displayed the social media posts showing board members fishing. As you can see here, dated October 16th, board members Jenkins and Williams are clearly fishing from the community dock. And in this image from October 23rd, President Winters herself is visible with fishing equipment. Sandra's face hardened into a mask of stone. She glanced at her watch repeatedly throughout my presentation, signaling her impatience. When I concluded, she did not even pretend to consider my arguments. The board will now deliberate, she announced, though no actual discussion followed. The 7 members merely exchanged knowing glances before Sandra continued. Appeal denied. The original fine stands, with an additional $100 administrative fee for wasting the board's time with frivolous complaints. Frivolous? I echoed, incredulous. I have provided clear evidence of selective enforcement and ambiguity in the rules. The board members you photographed were conducting official lake monitoring as part of their duties, Sandra stated coldly. Furthermore, your continued disrespectful attitude has been noted. Daily fines of $50 will commence until you sign a compliance agreement acknowledging the violations. The vote was unanimous, 7-0 against my appeal. As I gathered my materials, I noticed several homeowners avoiding my gaze. One elderly gentleman shook his head sympathetically but quickly looked away when Sandra glanced in his direction. The atmosphere of intimidation was palpable. On my drive home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the lake I was now forbidden to enjoy despite living on its shore. The beauty that had drawn me to this property now seemed tainted by pettiness and power games. That night, I calculated that at $50 per day, the fines would reach thousands of dollars within months. My dream home was becoming a financial nightmare. As I sat on my back patio staring at the moonlight reflecting off the forbidden waters, I noticed Sandra and her husband walking along the opposite shore. They stopped at a small inlet, and even in the dim light, I could see the unmistakable motion of casting a fishing line. The hypocrisy was so brazen that it bordered on surreal. That night, I made a decision. I would not be selling my home and moving away like the Andersons had done. I would not be surrendering to Sandra's reign of selective enforcement. I needed a different approach entirely, one that would change the rules of the game. The daily fines began accumulating with alarming speed. Each morning, I would check my mailbox to find another notice from the HOA. $50, $100, $150, the numbers climbed steadily. By the end of the first month, I owed over $1,500, and the HOA had started sending threatening letters about property liens. The stress began affecting my sleep and concentration at work. As a software project manager for a financial technology firm, I needed to be sharp and focused, but thoughts of the ongoing battle consumed me. One night, unable to sleep, I sat at my computer reviewing the county records I had collected. Almost absent-mindedly, I decided to search for more information about Lakefront Holdings, LLC. The company name had appeared in the original property documents, but seemed to have vanished from more recent HOA communications. I searched business registries, property records, and financial databases, following a trail of corporate filings and name changes. At 2:13 a.m., I found something extraordinary. Lakefront Holdings, LLC still existed, but it had been through several ownership changes. The company was now a subsidiary of Regional Investment Group, a mid-sized firm that specialized in commercial real estate and land management. Most significantly, their annual reports showed the lake property as a non-performing asset that had been generating maintenance costs without revenue for several years. The implications hit me like a thunderbolt. The lake itself was not owned by the HOA. It was owned by an investment company that appeared to have forgotten about it or considered it too insignificant to manage actively. The HOA had been operating as if they owned the lake, but they merely had limited management rights granted decades ago. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of heading to the office, I began assessing my financial situation. My job paid well, and I had been saving aggressively for most of my career. I had a substantial 401k, a diverse investment portfolio, and very little debt aside from my mortgage. I opened my financial planning software and ran several scenarios, calculating what would happen if I liquidated certain investments or took out a home equity line of credit. The numbers looked promising, but I needed more information. How much was Willow Lake worth? What would Regional Investment Group ask for it? Would they even consider selling? I crafted a carefully worded email to Regional Investment Group's acquisitions department, identifying myself as a property developer interested in discussing one of their assets in the Lakeview Estates area. I received a response the next day from Marcus Reynolds, a junior acquisitions manager. Our firm would be happy to discuss any of our properties in that region. Could you specify which asset has caught your interest? I suggested a coffee meeting rather than continuing by email. We agreed to meet at a cafe downtown, far from the prying eyes of Lakeview Estates residents. Marcus was younger than I expected, perhaps in his early 30s, eager and somewhat inexperienced. When I mentioned Willow Lake specifically, his reaction was revealing. Willow Lake, that is a challenging asset. We inherited it through an acquisition 5 years ago. The management agreement with the HOA has been problematic. They act as if they own it, but contribute nothing to maintenance costs or liability insurance. Our legal department has advised that untangling the situation might not be worth the expense. Have you considered selling it? I asked, trying to sound casual. To be honest, we have discussed it internally. The lake generates no revenue but creates potential liability. However, the HOA would be the natural buyer, and they seem to believe they already effectively control it. What if there were another interested buyer? I suggested. Marcus looked intrigued. That would certainly simplify matters from our perspective. Are you representing a development group? Something like that, I replied. What asking price has your company considered? When Marcus mentioned a figure, I struggled to maintain my poker face. The number was substantial but not impossible, roughly equivalent to 1 year of my salary. For the actual lake that encompassed several acres of water rights, it was surprisingly affordable. I would need to conduct due diligence, of course, I said. Environmental assessments, title searches, and a thorough review of all agreements with the HOA. Of course, Marcus agreed. I can send you our file on the property. It includes the original agreements and correspondence with the HOA. Over the next few weeks, Marcus and I continued our discussions in coffee shops and park benches far from Lakeview Estates. I learned that Regional Investment Group was indeed eager to offload what they considered a liability. Their legal department had prepared a sale package that would transfer all rights while indemnifying them from any future disputes with the HOA. Meanwhile, the fines from the HOA continued to accumulate. Sandra Winters had escalated her campaign, adding violations for creating community discord and undermining board authority to my growing list of infractions. The total now exceeded $3,000, and the threats of legal action grew more explicit with each notice. But for the first time since this conflict began, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The power dynamic was shifting, though Sandra and her board remained blissfully unaware. In our latest meeting, Marcus had confirmed that Regional Investment Group was prepared to accept my offer for Willow Lake. The company's legal team was already drafting the sales agreement. We will need to keep this confidential until closing, I told Marcus. The HOA situation is complex. Marcus nodded knowingly. We figured as much. Regional Investment will be glad to have this asset off our books without a protracted battle with the HOA. They have been surprisingly difficult to work with over the years. As I shook hands with Marcus to conclude our meeting, I felt a surge of determination. I was no longer just fighting against Sandra's petty tyranny. I was working towards something much more significant. The lake that had brought me peace would soon be truly mine, and the rules were about to change dramatically. The following weeks were a whirlwind of financial maneuvering and legal consultations. I began systematically liquidating my non-retirement investments, converting stocks and bonds into available cash. My financial advisor questioned the sudden move. This is unusual for you, Michael. You have always been a long-term investor. What is prompting this change? I have identified a unique investment opportunity, I explained vaguely. One with significant personal value. Next, I contacted several banks about financing options. While I had substantial savings, purchasing the lake outright would deplete my emergency fund. A home equity line of credit would provide the additional capital needed while keeping some reserves intact. 3 banks competed for my business, and I selected the one offering the most favorable terms. With financing secured, I needed specialized legal assistance. David recommended Andrea Morrison, an attorney who specialized in complex real estate transactions and water rights. If you are serious about this, Andrea is your best option, David assured me. She has handled several cases involving bodies of water and property disputes. Andrea's office occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building with panoramic views of the city. Her reputation as one of the sharpest real estate attorneys in the state was well earned. After signing confidentiality agreements, I explained my situation in detail. "So you want to purchase a lake to resolve an HOA dispute?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "That is certainly a novel approach." "It is more than that," I replied. "The lake is why I bought my home. It brings me peace, and the current owners are neglecting it while the HOA abuses their limited authority." Andrea nodded thoughtfully. "Let me see the documents you have collected." For the next hour, she reviewed everything from the original development plans to the management agreement between Lakefront Holdings and the HOA. "This is fascinating," she said finally. "The HOA genuinely appears to have overstepped their authority. They have management rights for surface activities, but those rights are limited to reasonable regulations that do not substantially impair traditional water enjoyment by property owners." "So their fishing ban is invalid?" I asked. "Almost certainly, but more importantly, they have no right to prevent the actual owner from selling the property." Andrea leaned forward. "If you purchase this lake, you will control the water rights. The HOA will maintain certain limited management responsibilities unless you negotiate a new agreement." "And could I restrict access to certain individuals, like board members who have been selectively enforcing rules?" Andrea smiled. "As the owner, you would have considerable latitude in establishing access policies, provided they do not violate anti-discrimination laws or existing easements." With Andrea's guidance, I assembled a specialized legal team to handle the purchase. The process was complex, involving environmental assessments, water quality testing, and detailed reviews of all existing agreements. Throughout this period, I maintained absolute secrecy. I continued paying my HOA dues while ignoring the mounting fines for fishing violations. When neighbors inquired about my ongoing dispute with the board, I simply said I was exploring my options. 4 weeks into the process, Andrea arranged a meeting with the legal representatives from Regional Investment Group. The conference room featured a large table covered with stacks of documents awaiting signatures. "Before we proceed," said the company's chief counsel, "I want to confirm that you understand the potential complications. The HOA believes they have greater authority over this water body than they legally possess. They may contest this sale." "I understand," I replied. "My legal team has prepared for that possibility." "Very well. Regional Investment Group is prepared to proceed with the sale as outlined in the agreement." For the next 2 hours, I signed document after document, initialing each page of the complex legal agreements. When I reached the final signature line on the deed transfer, I paused briefly. This was the largest single purchase of my life, dwarfing even my home mortgage. With a deep breath, I signed my name, making me the legal owner of Willow Lake. "Congratulations, Mr. Davis," said Andrea as we left the building. "You now own approximately 27 acres of water and the land 15 feet beyond the shoreline at normal water levels." The reality of what I had accomplished began to sink in. I had leveraged a significant portion of my financial resources to purchase a lake, a bold move that would have seemed absurd just months earlier. Yet the sense of satisfaction was undeniable. Back at my office, Andrea and her team outlined the jurisdictional boundaries of my new property. "The HOA has limited management rights for surface activities, but you control access, fishing rights, and any commercial use of the water. Additionally, You can revoke or modify their management rights with proper notice. And how should we proceed with the HOA? I asked. I recommend a strategic approach. We have prepared legal notices that establish your ownership and outline the actual scope of the HOA's authority. We can deliver these at your discretion. Not yet, I decided. The monthly HOA meeting is next week. I think that would be the perfect time to make this announcement. As I left Andrea's office clutching the leather portfolio containing proof of my ownership, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls. I barely recognized the person staring back at me. The passive homeowner who had once accepted the HOA's arbitrary rules was gone, replaced by someone transformed by newfound power and purpose. The week before the HOA meeting, I meticulously prepared my presentation with Andrea's help. We created a comprehensive information packet for distribution, complete with maps showing property boundaries, historical ownership records, and a clear outline of water rights. Andrea would attend the meeting as my legal counsel, ready to address any challenges to the legitimacy of the purchase. Remember, this is not about revenge, Andrea cautioned. This is about establishing clear legal boundaries and your rights as the lake owner. I nodded, though I could not deny the satisfaction I felt imagining Sandra's reaction to my announcement. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening at the community center. I arrived 30 minutes early to set up the projector and organize my materials. A few curious homeowners watched as I tested the equipment and arranged packets on a side table. "Big presentation tonight?" asked Mrs. Henderson, an elderly resident who rarely missed a meeting. "You could say that," I replied with a smile. "I think it will be quite informative." By 7 o'clock, the room had filled with about 40 residents, a larger turnout than usual. Word had spread that something interesting might happen. The board members entered together, taking their places at the front table. Sandra Winters looked particularly smug as she called the meeting to order. "Welcome to the November meeting of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. We have a full agenda tonight, so let us proceed efficiently. First, approval of last month's minutes." The routine business proceeded glacially. Budget reports, landscape committee updates, and discussions about holiday decorations filled the first hour. I sat patiently in the back row beside Andrea, waiting for the new business portion of the agenda. "Next item, new business," Sandra finally announced. "Do we have any new business to discuss?" I raised my hand and stood before being acknowledged. "Yes, I have a matter to present." Sandra's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Davis, you must be recognized by the chair before speaking." "My apologies, Madam President. I would like to address the meeting regarding an important development affecting our community." "Very well, you have 3 minutes." As I approached the podium, Andrea followed, carrying her briefcase. She took a position slightly behind me, her professional presence adding gravity to the moment. "Good evening, neighbors. For those who do not know me, I am Michael Davis from 427 Lakeside Drive. I would like to introduce my attorney, Andrea Morrison." Sandra interrupted immediately. "Mr. Davis, legal representatives are not permitted to address the board without prior approval." "Ms. Morrison is not here to address the board," I clarified. "She is here to assist me with a significant announcement." I connected my laptop to the projector and displayed the first slide. A satellite image of Willow Lake with property boundaries clearly marked. For the past several months, I have been researching the ownership and management of Willow Lake. What I discovered was surprising. Despite the HOA's claims of authority over the lake, the actual ownership belonged to Lakefront Holdings LLC, later acquired by Regional Investment Group. Murmurs spread through the audience. Sandra leaned forward, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the table. "Mr. Davis, this is not relevant to—" "Please allow me to finish," I continued firmly. "As of last Thursday, ownership of Willow Lake has changed hands. I am now the legal owner of this body of water and the surrounding shoreline." I clicked to the next slide, displaying the official deed transfer with my name clearly visible. The room erupted in gasps and whispered conversations. Sandra's face transformed from dismissive to confused to horrified as understanding dawned. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "The lake is community property managed by the HOA." Andrea stepped forward and placed a stack of documents on the board's table. "These are certified copies of the deed transfer and property records dating back to the original development. The HOA never owned the lake. You merely had limited management rights granted by the previous owner, rights that were consistently overextended." I resumed my presentation, my voice steady and controlled. "As the new owner of Willow Lake, I am implementing revised access and usage policies effective immediately. All residents will maintain their deeded water access rights. However, the following individuals are specifically prohibited from any lake activities, including fishing, boating, and swimming." The next slide displayed a list of names. The 7 board members who had voted unanimously against my appeal, with Sandra Winters at the top. "This is outrageous." Sandra stood, her face flushed with anger. "You cannot restrict board members from community amenities." "The lake is not a community amenity," Andrea interjected calmly. "It is private property with limited access easements. Mr. Davis, as the owner, has the legal right to determine who may use his property beyond those with deeded access rights." The room filled with murmurs and whispers. Some homeowners appeared shocked, others were visibly amused by this turn of events, while a few seemed concerned about what these changes might mean for them. "Furthermore," I continued, "all arbitrary restrictions on fishing for property owners with deeded lake access are hereby revoked. All accumulated fines related to lake usage are considered null and void." Sandra attempted one final protest. "This will not stand. The board will challenge this purchase immediately." Andrea smiled politely. "The board has no standing to challenge a legal property transfer between willing parties. However, we welcome any legal inquiries through proper channels." As the meeting descended into chaos, with board members huddling in urgent consultation and homeowners approaching me with questions, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted, and for the first time in months, I looked forward to fishing on my lake the following morning. The aftermath of my announcement spread through Lakeview Estates like ripples across water. By the following day, every resident had heard about the lake's change in ownership. Many approached me with questions, congratulations, or concerns about what this meant for their access. My first official act as lake owner was to install a new community notice board at the main access point. It displayed the Willow Lake usage guidelines, a single page of reasonable rules focused on safety, environmental protection, and courtesy. The guidelines were notably shorter and clearer than the HOA's convoluted restrictions had been. Fishing permitted from 5:00 a.m. to 9:00 p.m. daily. Catch and release encouraged. No permit required for residents with deeded access rights. Below this notice was a separate, smaller sign that simply stated, "Access restricted for the following individuals," followed by the names of the 7 board members. The message was unmistakable, yet delivered without unnecessary drama. Over the following week, neighbors I had barely spoken with before stopped by to introduce themselves. Frank brought over a bottle of whiskey to celebrate. "I never thought I would see the day," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Sandra has ruled this neighborhood like a petty dictator for years. The look on her face when you showed that deed, I will treasure that memory forever." Other residents shared similar sentiments, often in hushed tones as if still afraid of potential repercussions. I began issuing simple fishing permits to interested homeowners, not because they were required, but as a symbolic gesture of the new management approach. The permits were beautiful certificates featuring an illustration of the lake and my signature as owner.